Good afternoon. We're the last panel, but we don't think we're the least. We're the brave souls who ventured into First Lady scholarship sometimes before that was the place to be. I'm Maurine Beasley, the moderator and commentator from the University of Maryland at College Park. And as a personal note, years ago when I was struggling up the academic trail, I was told by an eminent person in my field, which is journalism, not history, that if you want to amount to anything, you better stay away from those women. So I would like to say that I bet he never thought that I would be at a conference with real historians, really distinguished people who know far more than I ever will, at the best liberal arts college in the United States, talking about first ladies. So you see, people who pioneer sometimes manage to do pretty well, I guess. I'm going to introduce our distinguished panelists one by one. Of course, we know Katherine Sibley. Now, I want to thank her and Williams College, of course, for putting on this conference. If it weren't for Katherine and her book, which she's edited, The Companion to Florence Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover, none of us would be here. So I think we owe her another round of applause. Yes, hold up the book. I don't have a copy because I didn't have anything in that book, unlike the rest of you smart people. Yes.
Oh, there you go. There you go.
Yes, good. Good. And I think she is a very brave person, because when I looked at her biography, I thought, my goodness, here's somebody who is a scholar of international relations, who's written books on the Cold War, who's a professor of history, St. Joseph's University, and she has not only gone into the 1920s, which we are here to celebrate today, but she is even editing a second companion book. Anybody who's ever edited anything knows what pitfalls there are. Since she has lived through the pitfalls of the first volume, which we see before, it is amazing that she is willing to undertake the pitfalls of a second volume, which will be a companion to the study of first ladies.
That's not ladies' home companion.
Oh, no. This is first-class scholarly research, recognized as such, with emphasis on historiography. But I really think it is a remarkable testimony to how far women's history has come, that you can have a person with Professor Sibley's background in international relations and in the Cold War editing a book on first ladies, and not only that, having written a book on first ladies. First Lady Florence Harding, Behind the Tragedy and Controversy. So Professor Sibley is our first speaker.
Thank you so much, Maureen. That's very kind. Thank you. Well, yes, I know the Ladies' Home Companion reminds me of those sewing circles you were talking about before, right? Yes. So thank you once again. This is just such a delight. Now, speaking of Florence, here she is. So we are, the three of us, going to speak about the three first ladies of the 1920s and early 1930s today, and recognition that first lady scholarship has really burgeoned, and I have to thank my colleagues because they have been a huge part of this. At least two of them well before me, and now Teri has joined our flock, and we are just so thrilled. So it's an exciting field. So Florence Harding and historiography. Florence Harding, as you may know, has been, in fact, in some ways, I'm going to echo quite a bit of what Rick was talking about earlier for the first few panels, as you will see in these slide collection. She has been maligned, she has been overlooked, she has been discredited, she has been caricatured in historiography and the popular press, and most famously with, oh, now it's not quite, is it this one? Thank you. Most famously, perhaps, with the man we've already heard from today, or about, Francis Russell and the Shadow of Blooming Grove, the book that was the first to use the long thought to have been all burned up papers in the Harding collection in Ohio in 1968. And Rick told us already quite a bit about the thesis of this book, but I will just mention what Russell said about Florence. The withered harridan, Harding called the Duchess, sexless, with the brittle quality of an autumn leaf. If she had only been warm, sensuous, buxom, he attested, Harding might have led a very successful life as a Marian editor and never attempted the presidency. You see. Russell, an expert on anatomy, apparently claimed that she was actually a hermaphrodite. I don't know how he knew these things. But more than 30 years earlier, Alice Roosevelt Longworth, a former friend of Florence, had also slammed her in her 1933 book, Crowded Hours, as a drinks-toting, bitter woman, probably not having as much fun even as this woman, despite the ongoing prohibition. And of course, we have already heard about this man, Gaston Means, who accused her of murdering her husband in his book that we know, of course, is a tissue of lies. Thank you for alerting us to that, Rick, earlier. Now, there were exceptions like the more broad-minded Robert K. Murray, who we have been hearing about already today on several occasions, but the negative images have lived on, and they live on to this very day in shows like Boardwalk Empire. This is Nan Britton's character. The assertions of Nan Britton's White House trysts live on in the show as if they were real, although they have never credibly been demonstrated, but they now have new currency. So Nan Britton's accusations that she bore the president's daughter continue to be believed by many Americans who watch Boardwalk Empire. Now, this past July, we heard about this a little bit already, the Harding love letters were at last released at the Library of Congress. The focus returned once again to the president's one documented love affair. This did happen, that with Carrie Phillips. Here, interesting picture of Florence and Carrie together at some kind of a Chautauqua event. Warren liked to go and pretend he was Alexander Hamilton and give speeches, this sort of thing. So they were friends, and then, alas, the relationship emerged. Now, because the papers came out this summer, because the letters came out, once again, the focus is now on Harding's scandals. The relationship is defined by this infidelity, and the story of Florence and their marriage and the interesting role she had in the First Ladyship has been temporarily forgotten by such headlines as these. But let's get past that. It's really unfortunate because there were many, many people who wrote wonderful things and have been writing wonderful things, like Robert Farrell, like Carl Anthony. I've tried myself to contribute to their oeuvre on Florence, a very, very interesting woman. She had, as you may know, a life that was quite challenging. Early on, she had a son with a ne'er-do-well husband who left her. This is Marshall here. She also, of course, later met Maurine and had a very interesting life with him in his newspaper business. Really an independent woman who was active on the campaign trail, active in his newspaper business before he was in the campaign world. She had passionate friendships with interesting women like Evelyn Walsh McLean. She had a really very, very interesting life. And it's sad that today we seem to remember her by these tabloid headlines. But let's drop those for the moment and let's talk about the interesting contributions she made. One of the things I think that is most interesting about Florence Harding is that she really captured this celebrity culture that was very prominent in the 1920s. Hollywood stars in those days, as likely to be Republican as Democrat, came to support the Harding administration and to lobby for them. And she herself was keen to get women involved in politics. After all, it was the 19 teens and 1920s, and as we talked about earlier in this conference, suffrage was a huge shift that happened for women. She was, of course, a believer in Hollywood stars and other stars as well. Sometimes they guided her guidance of her husband, but that was okay, because she transcended that all the same. She was given a warning that he was going to die from her astrologer, Madame Marcia. At the moment that he was being nominated for the presidency. And nevertheless, she did not discourage him from running. She went along with it, and look what happened. Very sad. We'll get to that. Theirs was an age of many interesting trends and pastimes, like the celebrity culture, the Hollywood. This is actually at one of the baseball games that they would attend. And she embraced it all. And in fact, she embraced the public and the cultural concerns of her time in such a way that she wanted people to come to the White House and enjoy that with her as well. And as we know, the previous First Lady, Edith Wilson, and her husband, had been very closed in their approaches to the White House. Well, of course, he was sick for quite a while, but even before that, the sheep were allowed to roam and be fleeced, but not so much the American public. But it changed when Florence came, and she invited people in for the Easter egg rolls and for concerts and for strolls about the grounds. She also invited in journalists because she knew that although she herself was not comfortable speaking directly to journalists on the record, she knew that they would enjoy coming to the White House and seeing the kinds of things that she was doing, the festivities, the receptions, and she won great interest for this. So she was really a very public First Lady, and I think in that way she was a huge switch from her predecessor, naturally, but even from other First Ladies. I think in that way we can kind of put her in a transitional role as a First Lady, because she was out there with her husband. She was someone who was very interested in causes. She was very visible. She welcomed people's visits. This is Madame Curie. And she also became a celebrity herself, visible in newsreels, exploiting photo ops like this one with these visiting Filipino women. She was snapped, interviewed, and movied, one paper wrote. Mrs. Harding is a star. And she took advantage of this. She was compelled in some ways to meet this appetite for style. She spent a lot of money on her clothes. They showered her, these designers in New York, with new outfits in her signature color of Harding blue. And she took quite a bit of care about this. It mattered to her. And so again did her accessibility to the public. This is the New Year's reception of 1921. People lined up for blocks, thousands of people, and she shook hands with every one of them. After this happened, she would collapse in bed, for days, and her hand would be sort of this limp rag. But this is what she did, this is what her husband did, this is what people did in these days. They felt, at least in the 1920s, that they should be accessible, that this was a public charge that she had. Now, the other thing that makes her, I think, an interesting transitional First Lady, doesn't seem to be wanting to go forward. Oh, there we are. Was that she did have a number of causes, and this, I think, takes her in a new direction from her predecessors as well. So one of them was, this is her little dog, obviously, Laddie Boy, but she was very interested in animal welfare, and she was concerned, for instance, about the attacks on seals and other animals who were being hurt in some of the fishing industry. She was very, very open, and she really hated rodeo. She went to one with Evelyn Walsh McLean. She thought this was very abusive. So she had some concerns and some issues. And she was someone who would publicize these and let people know about them. At the same time, because she was so accessible, because she was visible, because she was out there, when she became ill with her terrible illness that had plagued her since about 1905 and was largely the reason, I think, for her husband's infidelity, because she was indisposed for a good bit of the time, her nephritis, her kidney ailment. When this happened in 1922, and she was completely disabled for some time, for many months, convalescing, and only in her mind, I think, because of this hypnotist that she believed in, who told her in the readings that she did, this fellow called Coué, he was this French hypnotist, mind over matter, and she gripped her hands tightly, and she said, I am going to get better, and she did get better, and she told the American people about it, and everybody knew, and they prayed for her, and it seemed to work, at least then, not later, sadly. She died after he left the White House with the same disease. But this kind of experience that she had made her very sympathetic to the veterans, and we've heard about the Veterans Bureau and this new role the government had at the time. And she was someone who took a big step in this direction, brought them to the White House, visited them, felt a sympathy with them. It was one of her many causes. She, of course, was also interested in women prisoners and worked hard to improve conditions for them. She didn't shrink at offending prejudices. We talked about her husband's speech in Birmingham, such a significant event, but she herself also stood up for black defendants in the South. She supported her husband's progressive views on racial equality. Now, she did recover from that illness. Perhaps it was the praying, perhaps it was just her hypnotism, whatever it was, she got better, and she continued to be visible and encourage women to vote, as she had done, and also to take a trip to Alaska, the first lady to go to Alaska. Now, people thought she was going to die on this trip because, remember, her health was only just recovering, and they actually packed a coffin in the ship that took them across from Seattle. Can you imagine? But, of course, I think we know what happened on the trip, and it wasn't her death, it was his. Very suddenly on, somebody brought this date up before, August 2nd, yes, 1923, a day that will live in infamy, he died. And it wasn't bad crab. It seems to have, and actually it wasn't even her. No, she did not murder him. It's true. You heard it here first. No, he actually, I think he had a heart attack, but it was a very, very, this was a moment for her. She had to plan 3 funerals, one in San Francisco, very quick one, and then onto the train they had to go and travel the 96 hours across the country, stopping slowly through all the, I mean, when they got to Chicago, the train was completely mobbed. It was unbelievable that she survived in some ways. People were trying to board the train. People loved Harding. It's hard to remember that, isn't it? It's hard to believe that when we hear all the bad things about it. They loved him. And in the end, she had to come back, of course, to Washington and handle a funeral. You know, she got some help, but still it was a very stressful moment. And then they had to go to Ohio and have another. So she was a first lady who lived through a time of great change for women. Change that sadly she didn't get to see so much of because she died about a year and a half after her husband back in Ohio. She lived in Washington for a while, and I think if she stayed in Washington, she might have lived longer because she did come down with nephritis again, but she had some interests here. But unfortunately, her doctor encouraged her to go back to Ohio, and I think she kind of gave up at that point, and she didn't get to ever drive again or do some of the things that she enjoyed. But and of course, part of the problem, too, that maybe depressed her was just at this moment her husband's administration scandals were breaking out. Now, she herself, of course, had nothing to do with this. Her husband, I don't believe he knew any of this was happening, but sadly, he trusted his friends too much, right? He was a dear man, a very lovable man, I think, and unfortunately, people took advantage of him. And so, leaving us with the first lady who I think probably many of us remember better, I would like to suggest that I think Florence made the cracks in the mold that she broke, and a very interesting first lady of a really a transitional nature, and now we're going to hear about some more. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Now we'll hear from our next presenter, Teri, who is a graduate student. Let me tell you a little bit about her and some of the things she told me last night when we chatted at the dinner. Teri Finneman is a doctoral student at the School of Journalism at the University of Missouri, which happens to be one of my alma maters. I think it's wonderful that we have here a presenter who is a student. She told me that she has already written 8 articles, published 8 articles, and 3 book chapters, and she hasn't even completed the prospectus of her dissertation, which sounds wonderful. So I'm sure she will complete it shortly and finish her dissertation, which is going to be on women in politics. She also told me that the reason she got into Grace Coolidge is because she took a history class at the University of Missouri, and she told the professor she was interested in writing about a first lady. He said, "Oh, that's too trivial. Don't do that." And so being a woman who knows her own mind, she was determined to do so. And now we will hear from Teri Finneman.
I have my own. How do we pull up? I teach a class with 200 undergraduate students, so therefore my lecture today is very similar to that. You're going to see pictures and discussion points. If I'd had more time, there'd be videos as well. And normally I walk up and down the aisles when I'm lecturing to make sure people are still awake, so it's going to be different for me to stand still when I talk today. So I've divided my talk into 4 main points today, and the first one is an examination of the Coolidge's marriage and how historians have differed in discussion of this topic throughout time. So I consider myself very fortunate, well, all of us very fortunate, actually, that both Calvin and Grace had autobiographies. Critique them as you may, especially Calvin's, but I found them to be a really great resource. So Calvin doesn't talk very much about Grace and his personal life in his autobiography, but he does note about Grace that she has borne with my infirmities and I have rejoiced in her graces. And it was Grace herself who used this comment about how they have vastly different temperaments. So that gives you a brief insight into the Coolidges and their marriage. So we all know of the stereotype of Silent Cal and how he was very quiet, uncommunicative, and sometimes glum. The whole weaned on a pickle phrase that's been used about Calvin. And his wife was known for being very warm and friendly and outgoing. So you had a bit of a opposites attract going on here. So in some of the early biographies about Calvin, they paint more of a wedded bliss type of theme. And as time goes on and you see more recent history books, you are getting a much more critical examination of the state of their marriage. So starting in the 1930s in the early books about Calvin, Edwin Wildman mentions that no story of Calvin Coolidge is complete without emphasizing the exceptional qualities of his wife. Every biography I've seen about the Coolidges mentions their opposing personalities. Right away in 1934, you already have the commentary about how much patience was required of Grace to be in this marriage because of these opposing personalities. However, we have William Allen White in his 1938 book about Calvin, noting that no more affectionate or dutiful husband ever came into the White House than Calvin Coolidge, and the president's pride in her was beautiful to see. Waxing poetic here, exaggerating maybe a little bit. Moving into the 1960s, when you have a biography about Grace that came out by Ishbel Ross, she tread carefully on the issues arising from the Coolidge's personality differences, perhaps because John Coolidge was very instrumental in helping her with the book, and perhaps because of the time period itself. So she, of course, mentioned, too, how the Coolidges complemented each other, talking about how they shared the same sense of humor, and that helps, collect them together. But she also notes that those who knew Mrs. Coolidge intimately felt that there were times when the compromises she had to make must have hurt. So we're starting to see some of the cracks and differences in the marriage at this point. Over the next 40 years, biographies of Grace Coolidge are very difficult to come by. There really wasn't much. Starting in the late 1980s and going into the 1990s, there's more scholarship done, and you start to see more of the critical examination of their marriage. So you have one comment saying, sometimes she became seriously upset and took a long walk or plunged into her vigorous knitting to keep herself in control. We have Caroli noting that Grace followed her husband's rules in the manner of an obedient child, and that there was a strain detected in Grace's attempts to keep things amicable with her husband. And so as the distance between the Coolidge era and historians grew greater, you're seeing more of this critique. Especially so in Robert Farrell's book in 2008 when the Boone papers were analyzed. And he notes that Calvin Coolidge tested the patience and resolve of his wife. There were even moments when the couple might have divorced. So, as I said, you're seeing much more this critical look. And so I think that there's still a lot of work that can be done examining the state of their marriage, but it brings up this discussion point that I have of how should historians juggle historical accuracy without becoming Us Weekly. And as I'm looking around the room, this is probably not an Us Weekly crowd, but I'm hoping you understand the general point that I'm making of political relevance versus period interest. How far do we go in examining the state of presidential marriages? The second theme that I have is the legacy of Grace herself and her political influence. Now, Grace was a different First Lady following Nellie Taft, Edith Wilson, and Florence Harding, who obviously had interest in politics and had their husband's ear, whereas Grace, it was very firmly stated that she knew nothing about politics, that she had nothing to do with Calvin's administration. She was more of the traditional First Lady. And I know that there are some historians who do not like that phrasing of traditional First Lady, but I think you know what I'm referencing as far as her role was to be a wife, a mother, and a hostess, okay? And so the early scholarship that you see, especially by Calvin's biographers, were really emphasizing that Grace had no role in the administration. She knew her role and women's place during that time. That her role was to support Calvin at home, and again, specifically, Mrs. Coolidge was never a part of the president's political family. One biographer, Claude Fuss, I hope I'm saying that right, in his 1940 book, took a similar stance and believed Grace helped Calvin by not gossiping, not being vain, subordinating her wishes to his, and being friendly. So how's that a summary of your life as First Lady right there? So again, Grace's role was in the home, wifely support. But Grace's biographers give her much more credit for what she did. The fact that she sometimes rescued her husband from social gaffes when they were at political and diplomatic events, using humor to help de-escalate tensions at times, her outgoing personality, her friendliness with everybody in Washington. Calvin himself, when he was vice president, wrote home to his father and said what an asset Grace was to his political life in Washington. She was very busy with parades and tree plantings and luncheons and dinners, which goes back to the trivial comment that my professor once said to me. When you talk about attending parades and luncheons, you could very easily blow that off as being trivial type of work, right? But the public relations role that she was playing for the administration is highlighted by Anthony in his 1990 book. And I think that you can't discount that and the work that these First Ladies do on their husband's behalf. She also visited children's hospitals. She was frequently in the newspaper having her picture taken with children, with her pets, including her raccoon, Rebecca. This is a very famous photo, obviously. And Calvin overall profited from her visibility. One thing that's really interesting to me and that Caroli noted is it would have been so great to see what Grace could have done as a First Lady if she was not under Calvin's rules for what she could and could not do. She had very strict things she had to go by. She could not bob her hair, she could not drive. One day when she wore pants, he told her immediately that that should not happen again. So she was a college-educated woman at this time. She had been a teacher for children who were deaf. She had this great platform of things she couldn't done, but she abided by her husband's wishes. And so a discussion point that I have is, what does it mean to be a politically influential First Lady? And I think we really need to think about the explication of politically influential and not just using a male hegemonic definition of what politically influential means. As far as life after the presidency, Grace lived for 24 more years after Calvin died, and she started to become a new person after this. And I'm not saying that she didn't love Calvin, but I'm saying that her life had more possibilities without these rules that she was under. And certainly being out of the White House itself changed that as well. But she bobbed her hair, she rode in an airplane, she did all these things that she hadn't been able to do before. She was helpful during World War II. She continued her work for children who were deaf. But in scholarship, you see very little attention paid to her life after the White House. The Ross book gives her 50 pages. That's the most it's ever been given. Most historical work only gives her a few sentences at best. So first ladies, I think, really need to have their life after the White House focused on as much. They don't just quit being the first lady as soon as they leave 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. They still have the reputation and the work that they're doing out in society, and I think that needs much more emphasis. How I got onto Grace Coolidge in the first place is I'm actually a journalism historian. And so I spent Christmas break 2 years ago reading almost 1,800 newspaper articles about Grace Coolidge and analyzing her coverage. And what was interesting to me was the very conservative viewpoint that the New York Times adopted in its framing of her. So this was obviously the time when there was battles going on during the first wave of feminism as far as if women should keep their traditional role versus the flapper movement that was going on. And so you see the New York Times specifically saying that Grace is not the leader of feminine thought for the nation, making very clear what was appropriate for women with that type of wording. The same thing with the second comment. Taking note of how Grace loved to knit, it mentions that she used an old-fashioned yarn, the sturdy opposite of what the flappers were using. So I'm very interested in word choices used by the media and how the words they choose show what's acceptable in society at a specific time. This is another comment in the media that has been very well played up, that Grace is very proud that her husband made decisions without ever consulting her. Certainly, again, the contrast, right, between Nellie Taft and Edith Wilson and Florence Harding, who the public was not really thrilled that they were so involved with their husbands' presidencies. So this was played up highly in many publications. In fact, the New York Times ran this comment 3 times in different stories, just to get that point across. And so what's interesting to me is when you look at Grace's media coverage after the White House, you start to see more of the real Grace. They wrote about how she did not excel as a cook. You know, they talked about when she bobbed her hair. And so I'm really interested in general in the unrealistic standards that I feel we have as a society, as historians, as journalists, the unrealistic standards we have for first ladies. And so I'm interested in how both historians and journalists can better cover this position and what we expect of women in general in society. So that is Grace Coolidge.
Thank you very much. We have lots to talk about when we have our discussion period, but now we have another presentation. This one by Nancy Beck Young, who's the department chair and professor of history at the University of Houston. She is one of the women, I think I'm correct in this, who's really been guided into First Lady Studies by Lou Gould of the University of Texas at Austin, who pioneered in making this a respectable academic study. Do you think that's correct?
That is correct. That is correct.
And I think a lot of us owe a lot to him, let's acknowledge that, because he has really made this something that people can go into and not have to apologize for working on. Her work involves study of Congress, the presidency, and of course First Ladies. And she has written a book on Henry Hoover, First Lady, which is part of the First Lady series published by the University Press of Kansas that Lou Gould has been the editor of. She now is working on 100 Days That Changed America, FDR, Congress and the New Deal, under contract with Oxford University Press. So, hear from Nancy.
Thank you, Maureen, for that overly generous introduction. Thank you, Katie, for inviting me to be a part of this project. Thank you, James, for your work organizing here on the ground. Thank you to everyone else at Williams College for putting this event together. And to just push what Maureen said a bit further, thank you in absentia to Lou Gould for getting all of this started in general and for bringing me into this very interesting conversation. So I want to start out by talking about maybe next steps in studying First Ladies. In some ways, for as legitimate as the study of First Ladies has become, we're going to write ourselves out of a business here pretty soon. There are only so many First Ladies about whom a biography can be written because there have only been so many women to serve as First Lady. As compared with what one of my professors said in graduate school when I made a comment somewhat critical of congressional biography, and he reared back and said, "You do not realize how many members of Congress do not yet have a biography and need one." And then, of course, what do I go and do? Write a dissertation on a congressional biography that I turned into a book, and I did get a job and I did get tenure, so it can be done, but I would never advise a student to do it. I'm with you on that. So how do historians who study First Ladies take the next step beyond biography and integrate the study of First Ladies in more directly into the narrative of American history? To do that, there are several binds that the historian of First Ladies would find him or herself in. There's the bind of doing women's history, but a First Lady is an elite woman, and we've moved well beyond what Gerda Lerner described as studying the women worthies, the elite women. So a women's historian who's doing an elite woman, you kind of have to justify it in those crowds. So there's that issue. There's also the bind of a First Lady as a political actor, and Teri, you touched on this some in your comments. First Ladies have no codified power. There is no job description for the First Lady. It is a position that has evolved with time and will continue to evolve with time. And I predict within our lifetimes it's going to evolve in very significant ways when we have our first dude, gentleman, etc. I was invited some years ago to give a paper on governors' spouses for the National Governors Association, and so as part of my research was finding out about the male spouses of governors, and I think it was Katherine Sebelius's husband who called himself the first dude, but that one has stuck with me. So that is going to be an issue that scholars should look into going forward. And to echo another point that Teri made, the need to take seriously the activities that are political, but maybe not capital P political, in which First Ladies engage, that make for successful presidencies. One last point on the macro level with regard to First Ladies, and then I'll dive into my subject, Henry Hoover. I like to contend that First Ladies at any given moment in history are a barometer for how society views women, but First Ladies are also somewhat of a lagging indicator in that barometric measure, because we have a more conservative definition of what we would want for a First Lady as opposed to your average or not so average female CEO, whatnot. First Ladies always seem to, in terms of what's acceptable, lag behind what's acceptable for the average woman. So in that way, I think that's another way we can integrate the story into the larger narrative. Okay, So we've already made the point, my co-panelists have made the point that the first ladies of the 1920s are transitional figures, and I think that that is also true for my subject, Lou Henry Hoover. The three first ladies of the 1920s, Florence and Grace and Lou, make Eleanor Roosevelt possible. And Eleanor Roosevelt casts such a large shadow over the three 1920s first ladies that they have been forgotten. And I'll have more to say about that with regard to Lou Henry Hoover in particular. So let me dive in a bit to Lou Henry Hoover. She was very much atypical for women of her generation. She was the oldest of two daughters, and her parents believed that it was appropriate and necessary to educate women. And her father was an outdoors person, and he didn't really care that he didn't have sons. He thought it important to expose his children to the outdoors. And so Lou learned to love nature at a very early age, fishing and all that goes with that. So that was central to the formation of her character. The fact that her parents did not put girl limits on her, and the fact that she was encouraged to love nature and enjoy the outdoor world. She was also born in Iowa in the same year as Herbert Hoover, and I've heard more than a few tourists at the Hoover Library question, I didn't know Herbert Hoover had a brother named Lou, seeing the gravesite and thinking that Lou Henry Hoover was male. So the things you overhear when you're researching at a presidential library do make for a certain amount of humor. Her family also migrated to California in a parallel fashion with Herbert going to California as an orphan. She wound up studying at Stanford University after hearing a lecture on geology, and she decided that that was for her, that she was no longer interested in teaching school or working in a bank or any of the other things that she had dabbled with after finishing a normal school program. So she was one of the first women in the country to take a degree in geology. And she comments to a college friend when she's finishing up that she wishes that her AB stood for a boy, because then she might be able to find a job. And so in her, I find some, well, she never used the word feminist that I could identify to describe herself. I nevertheless find some feminist traits or thinking in her career. She is an activist. She's very typical of elite women of her generation in that she's a joiner, and she joins all manner of organizations and becomes a leader in several of them, most importantly the Girl Scouts. And I found the Kansas series to be a huge challenge in the sense that the series has a formula. You get one chapter, I think you got two, but Eleanor is in her own category. You get one chapter that gets the lady to the White House years, you get 4 chapters on the White House years, and you get 1 chapter on the post-White House years. And compacting Lou Henry Hoover into 1 chapter for the period from 1874 to 1929 was daunting. I still have many bankers' boxes in the garage full of papers that someday I may do something with. But she had been terribly, terribly active before going into the White House. And so the White House was as much constraining for her as it was liberating and giving her a larger platform because of those expectations of what a first lady can and can't do. So it was an interesting tension. I want to focus on how Lou Henry Hoover responded to the Depression and get a little bit deeper into the Hoover's view of philanthropy, which I find to be noble and quaint and politically stupid, if I can go that far, and I'll explain what I mean. thousands and thousands and thousands of Americans wrote to Lou Henry Hoover asking for all manner of things, help to young people asking for help to pay for their college tuition. Someone wrote about a family member suffering from tuberculosis, and do you have advice to help with that? One person said, I just would like for you to send a potted begonia to my mother who is struggling. And another person wanted her to pay off the washing machine note. And so all manner of letters such as that. And the thing that was interesting to me is Lou Henry Hoover used her connections in voluntary culture to research out the veracity of the requests for aid. You get a letter from St. Louis, Missouri. Okay, so who does she know in St. Louis? And can you find out if this person who needs help with the washing machine note really does need help with the washing machine note? And if the claim proved to be true, then almost laundering money, not really, but the money was circuitously routed to the person in need of help so that the person would never know who her benefactress was. And that is found in a much larger scale with Lou Henry Hoover's role in planning for and constructing the Rapidan School near their Camp Rapidan. The mountain children there had no access to a public education, and the Hoovers thought that just wrong, and they paid for it out of their own pocket and with donations from friends, and they refused to publicize what they were doing because that would make their act no longer be philanthropy. And so I find it quaint and noble, but also there's that historical what if. What if they had publicized the good deed? What sort of benefit could have accrued politically in that regard? So I find that to be an interesting aspect of Lou Henry Hoover's White House years. She also, during the White House years, flirts with civil rights involvement ever so briefly. In 1928, at the same time Herbert was elected president, voters in Chicago sent Oscar Stanton DePriest to Congress, and he was the first African American to serve in Congress since the Reconstruction years. And he happened to be married, and his spouse, Jessie DePriest, happened to be African American as well. And so a very important social problem lands in Lou's lap, because one of the jobs of First Lady is to have a tea for the congressional spouses. How do we handle this with an African American woman? It's politically explosive, potentially. And so instead of having one mass tea, Lou Henry Hoover breaks up the guest list, and the women invited to the first several teas are being interviewed. Do you have the right sort of thinking? Can you come back to this, what is going to be a much smaller affair, because there weren't going to be that many women who would be able to behave themselves. So a much smaller tea is held at the end, and all of the invitations are delivered secretly, and no one knows about the tea before the tea. But after the tea, everyone knows, and several state legislatures, including Texas, passed resolutions condemning the Hoovers for defiling the White House by bringing an African American into it, and much, much vile language is used to that end. So, but after that, Lou Henry Hoover retreats, and there are not any more significant statements about racial inequity in America coming from her. Herbert said that she was very stung by the criticism, and I certainly understand why that is true, because I've read box after box after box of that criticism. So let me close out by talking about Lou's impact on the institution of the First Lady. She was able to accomplish much of what Grace wanted to but couldn't, including being the first Lady to speak on the radio. Grace really wanted to do that, but Calvin wouldn't let her. Well, Lou was able to and did. Lou went even farther than Florence in adopting a political program, her work to solve the issues of the Depression, and she makes White House entertaining a political act, as I suggested in talking about the Dupree's tea, but in other ways as well. One journalist asked, so who's going to be dining as a guest at the White House tonight? And the names were ticked off, and the person providing the information to the journalist said, well, isn't that newsworthy? And the journalist said, it would only be newsworthy if there was no one dining at the White House tonight. Because one thing Henry Hoover did was make sure there was a constant stream of guests into the White House to help Herbert unwind from the pressures of the presidency with entertainment, and she always made sure that the dinner table was balanced along gender lines so that Hoover was not troubled by having too much feminine talk going on at the table. And she was also very active on the campaign trail, more so than her predecessors, and completely overshadowed by Eleanor. And she makes that same conservative turn after the White House years that Herbert makes, befriending, among other things, the group Pro-America and getting really down in the trenches with her criticism of FDR and also Eleanor. And I'll stop there.
Well, we've heard 3 excellent presentations here, and I'm sure they've stimulated many questions from you. So I'll just make a few brief comments here, and then we can have more of an open discussion. One of the things that occurs to me about this is what we're really talking about here, and then Teri raised this, we're talking about presidential marriages, and we're talking about the use of presidential marriages in politics. We're talking about images. That's what makes the study of First Ladies so important, because we are becoming increasingly an image culture. You know, we're moving from print to images. And so we have to think about politics in terms of images. In the 1920s is this transitional era. Women get the vote in 1920. So what does Franklin Roosevelt say to Eleanor, even though they'd had their problems? 1920, he's a Democratic candidate for vice president. He says, Eleanor, you come along with me on the campaign trail and stand beside me. That's all she did, but anyway, she went. He recognized that. 1920, Florence Harding now. Granted, she may have not have gotten her due from history, but she sort of fit the caricature of the woman behind the throne. And that's not somebody who is necessarily liked. For example, if you read some of the things about Harding, you find that the Duchess helped direct the presidential campaign and squelched rumors that Harding wanted to drop out of the race. "We're in till hell freezes over," she reportedly shouted to his campaign manager. Then when he was nominated, she supposedly said, "Well, Warren Harding, I have got you the presidency. What are you going to do with it?" Now, it's interesting to me in this day and age that she didn't say, "What are we going to do with it?" She says, "What are you going to do with it?" Because she was operating behind the throne, so to speak. And yes, I certainly agree with comments have been made here. She got a pretty good press until, of course, the scandals broke out. But you have to remember that in the early 1920s, women reporters were just becoming organized in Washington. And of course, the National Press Club wouldn't have anything to do with them, but they formed their own club, the Women's National Press Club. And Florence made some overtures to this group. Because these were the women who wrote for the Women's and Society pages, and what little political coverage that was done by women would have been done by members of this group. They didn't like her. And I think some of that has affected the historical diminution of her role. For example, recovering from a near-fatal illness, heavily made up. Now, she wore makeup, and a lot of it, at a time when that was kind of questionable or just coming into style, you know. So here she is, recovering from an illness, heavily made up and wearing a rose-colored negligee. She invites the women journalists to visit her in the White House living quarters in 1923, where she describes her medical condition in such detail that members of the group say they are revolted. I think we could see some of that from the media presentations here. She always wore a black band around her neck. That was supposedly to conceal all these ugly things that those of us a certain age may have. She was 61 years old. She was older than Harding. And she looks older than he in these pictures, too. And she was somewhat jealous of Grace Coolidge, who was the younger and prettier wife of Vice President, because Calvin was Vice President under Harding. Grace looked better in her pictures than Florence did. Well, anyway, I think regardless of how much Warren may or may not have been a philanthropist, he was somewhat a philanthropist, we know at least. And so he's probably a little bit afraid of his wife. You get the impression that she was such a factor in his political career that he probably didn't keep her down as much as Calvin Coolidge and Herbert Hoover kept their wives down in the White House, and I'll mention that in a minute. Certainly Florence, thank you very much, Florence and Warren gave the impression of a marriage that had solid Middle Western values, this couple from Marion, Ohio. And you get into their marriage, you see something about marriages in general. Although it's hard to know, of course, all these private things. We move on, though, to Grace Coolidge and Calvin Coolidge. Got to remember, Grace Coolidge was a college graduate, a graduate of the University of Vermont, which at the time that was pretty unusual for women. And she was the first lady to have established herself professionally, because she had taught at a school for the deaf before her marriage, and she did keep a lifelong interest in the treatment of the hearing disabled. Now, she had sunny personality, attractive features, a flair for clothes, more so than her predecessor, Mrs. Harding. Mrs. Harding spent a lot of money on clothes, but she never looked that great. Or that's so they said. And, Grace Coolidge did. She looked much better. And she also had this skill at human relations, this ability to manipulate an image, even though her husband refused to let her say anything. In fact, there's one marvelous story that when she was out with these women, a Women's National Press Club, they said, "Oh, Mrs. Coolidge, please say something to us." And because she didn't want not to do it, she did talk to them, but she did it in sign language. See? But she was a beloved figure, and a charming antidote to her taciturn husband. One observer said she was, and get this, worth $1 million to the Republican Party. Because we must remember that women didn't get the vote. They weren't fully part of the citizenry of the United States until 1920. And there was all this concern among average women, you know, what women's roles were. And so women are sort of looking to the first ladies for some guidance here, or so I would submit. Maybe you disagree with me on that. And anyway, Grace Coolidge, though, managed to provide an image that was compatible with the Jazz Age. At the same time, it also fit the profile of a resident New England housewife. Now, to be able to do that took a lot of skill, particularly with a husband like Calvin, because we know all the things that he wouldn't let her do. But let's move on here to the cosmopolitan Lou Henry Hoover, fluent in 5 languages, including Chinese, one of the first women in the United States to obtain a degree in geology, a graduate of Stanford University, lived all over the world, wife of a wealthy man. Yeah, why didn't she get more recognition as First Lady? Well, I would submit it was because she failed, unlike Grace Coolidge, to recognize the tremendous importance of the mass media. This is the 20s. You have new developments in news photography. You have radio. Well, she didn't recognize the importance of radio. But you have newsreels. You have film. You have vast newspaper circulation. And what was her attitude toward reporters, toward these women reporters? Well, they hated her because she wouldn't give them the kind of copy that they needed to fulfill their jobs. There's one great story about a reporter for the Associated Press, Bess Furman, having to dress up like a Girl Scout to sneak into the White House to cover a Girl Scout Christmas party because Mrs. Hoover wouldn't let the reporters in. And now, Herbert was very controlling as far as her public image went. He was so protective that he voiced loud complaints whenever reporters wrote about his wife or family, believing that a woman, even First Lady, should remain in the background and never be subjected to intense reporting. And in that respect, he was quite different from his more successful successor, Franklin Roosevelt, who saw the importance of having a wife who was out in public and certainly didn't object to Eleanor's activism. So let's keep in mind that we're dealing here at a period, 20s, when women are moving from the private role that was really mandated to them as citizens. When they couldn't vote, they could exercise power only indirectly through husbands, through males, into a period when women are actually allowed to run for office themselves. Granted, not many did, and those who didn't, perhaps weren't too successful. But here we see First Ladies pictured, for example, at the polls with their husbands. That says something. That says something to ordinary women in America. We have pictures transmitted of the Associated Press and other news agencies at this time all across the country because we didn't get equipment that would do this very well until middle of 1920s. So you have First Ladies becoming more and more celebrities, and we're having a culture that's beginning to depend on the celebrity aspect of the White House to fill the needs of the news beast, as it was. So when we get to First Ladies, I think we can look at the emergence of women from the private sphere that they've been confined to for so long into the public sphere, and we can also look at the importance of the media as a factor in American politics. Thank you. Now we'll take questions, comments from the audience. Yeah?
Hi. We heard a little bit about Mrs. Harding as the power behind the throne, and we heard that she probably was getting good presses on the cheek from the couturiers and so on. But I'm thinking ahead to the White Houses where First Ladies of private secretaries, and you've long since got a protocol officer in the White House. And I'm thinking of, I was surprised not to hear more about the queens, the foreign potentates and their spouses, which would be, for a woman like Florence Harding, would be a model. What would the Queen of England want? How would she conduct herself? And I was a little surprised there wasn't any reference to this, really the regal type stuff which has come to dominate our culture.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, especially using the word throne and that sort of thing. I would probably take a little bit of exception to the idea of her being the power behind the throne. I think that kind of throws her into the light that some more critical scholars have said, about the Duchess who's kind of running everything. I don't quite see her in that role. I think she definitely consulted him, but he was definitely the president, and certainly she assisted him in running for the White House, but I don't think she was pulling the strings or anything like that. Also, she didn't actually get her outfits cheap. They cost quite a lot of money, and she talked about this to her daughter-in-law, actually, who sadly didn't get any of the, or too many of the clothes in hand-me-downs. Instead, Florence would send her sort of some calico to outfit, her children, but that's another story. But I don't think she would have looked to the Queen. She was kind of a folksy person. I guess I didn't get enough chance to maybe emphasize that, but if you think about how she was kind of welcoming everyone onto the White House and all that, I don't think she kind of saw herself as a queen or in it. That wasn't really her persona. I mean, they were pretty simple folks. She kept her friends from her Senate days. She did have Evelyn Walsh McLean, who was quite a bit of royalty, I guess, herself with her diamonds, but she was someone who was not really, I think, of that outlook at all, as far as like putting herself up on a pedestal or feeling queenly. Though I know what you're saying, which is that first ladies do kind of fit our version of what sort of royalty might be, the closest maybe that we get to that, but I don't know if that answers your question. Yes?
Now, my question is also for Katie, and that is, at the time of the Republican convention met, was not Florence reluctant to have Warren nominated? As after Warren's nominated, then she becomes enthusiastic and does all she can.
Yeah, I think she was somewhat reluctant especially because of Madame Marsh's predictions, which I alluded to a little bit. But I think she kind of, sort of what you were saying, I think she kind of threw herself into it. I think she was pretty excited about it. There was some back and forth, I think, behind the scenes. I think there was some concern. There were some tough times during the period leading up to the convention. Nobody really believed, that he was going to get as far as he got. We heard a little bit about that from Rick earlier today. But, yeah, I think that she was pretty much on board with it. I really, that was kind of my sense of it. Absolutely.
She never said, I see disaster ahead.
No, that she did really, she had Madame Marsh's prediction, and she believed that stuff. So she kind of had the sense that he wasn't going to live through the White House term, but, really, she believed this. But nevertheless, I think she embraced it because this was kind of where they were, and they had worked hard for this. And in fact, she got very angry later in the campaign, and I think you alluded to some of this, Rick, or perhaps someone else did, some of the rumors, that were passed about Warren and his ancestry, and it got pretty dire. And she was very angry about this. She thought they were so close to winning, and she was really behind it. I think she wanted it to happen. So,
yeah. Actually, it's a question for all three of you, and it's up on the previous question about what did or when did First Ladies begin to acquire regular staff, secretaries, that sort of thing, and did they differ through the three? Given that they had this public role, and or did they just hire them privately?
So the first paid by the federal government staff member comes during the Teddy Roosevelt presidency. And Lou Henry Hoover, and it would be incorrect to say East Wing because the East Wing doesn't exist until 1942, but Lou Henry Hoover does expand the size of her staff. Some of the early literature on Lou Henry Hoover suggests that she was a very difficult person for whom to work, that she would have elaborate hand gestures to communicate with, say, with the serving staff, etc. And certainly she came to a parting of the ways with one of her social secretaries, but there were other women who worked with Lou who had a very affectionate relationship with her, and one of these women worked with Lou to document the history of the White House. Lou got very interested in the White House history and got very interested in having the White House decorated in proper period furniture, and so she has an assistant working with her on that, and she has staff answering all of those letters that are coming in, and so she does expand it a bit.
Yeah, no, if I could just mention, Florence had this, her assistant, Ms. Harlan, who was the daughter of the Supreme Court Justice, and she was essential to Florence. And Florence began, really even before she was fully in the White House, her correspondence got so overwhelming that she had to apologize. She started to have to type. And that, I guess, was a new sort of departure. Yeah.
And viewed as not ladylike for a first lady to type her correspondence. Lou and Grace were very close friends, and Lou typed a letter to Grace and commented on, "Oh, how terrible it would be if the White House secretary knew I had typed this letter to you." They had flower nicknames for one another. I'm forgetting which flower they called one another, but the notions of traditional womanhood.
Right. Not to be typed out.
Not to be typed out. That's not feminine.
Yeah. But the job had grown.
I had a question for Teri. We read that when the Coolidge's son died in the White House, that it had really cast a pall over the presidency, and that Calvin became, if anything, more of a dill pickle. What was the effect both of Calvin and the actual death of the son on Grace?
Yeah, well, certainly Calvin took it very, very difficult, not well at all. He blamed himself. He felt that if he had not been in the presidency, his son would not have been playing tennis and had access to the life of the rich in the first place, and never would have got the blister on his foot and died. So Calvin took it very, very rough. Grace did as well, but Grace was she had a very strong faith. So even though she took it rough, she, believed that God was taking care of him, that for years, I think afterward, she would put a rose or a vase of roses out to represent Cal Jr. So her faith really got her through that. But I have read some books about how it was a very difficult time in the Coolidge's marriage, knowing how to cope with it.
Other comments?
Well, I was intrigued by Nancy's opening comments about how do we fit first ladies into broader literatures, and everyone really addressed this in different ways. And one thing that strikes me already from our conversation is that it's very easy to slide into the kind of facile gendered language that, we're all talking about image, and image is part of this, but the farther down that you go, how cheap were the dresses, why aren't they given to the so-and-so, you get into the categories of gossip or the Us Weekly sort of thing, right? And then re-problematizing that in terms of historical questions, and not just sort of salacious things that might get you, is really deeply problematic, especially for this era, when the role isn't as public in the way that later First Lady, or isn't as overtly political, right? So you have to do a nuanced analysis to show how political it is. Yeah. And the double bind is that you're talking about things like images and dresses and whatever. So is that just baked into the problem here? You can't separate the challenges of doing serious historical work on first ladies, especially in an era when they aren't as obviously politically active for the type of audience that would receive it in that way.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, yeah. And so much of I showed you that little newspaper clipping. So much that Florence collected those. They were self-referential. These were the things that covered her social affairs or affairs that she was involved with, and they always talked about her dresses, and you get the sense, well, either she liked people to comment on them, because why else would she collect these things, or that this was all they commented on, so this was sort of all she could collect. And yeah, I think we as historians have to take some more detachment probably from that and say, yeah, this was what the media focused on, but it shouldn't necessarily sum up, right, the whole story exactly. But,
well, I think we've made celebrities out of the people who live in the White House, even to ridiculous lengths. I'm thinking the Kennedy administration made celebrities out of Caroline's pets. For hamsters, for example, and this is ludicrous, but this is a celebrity-driven culture, So if you're going to look at the political process, you have to look at these people as celebrities and at the media treatment of the celebrities.
Yeah,
and I think
intensely biased, right? Michelle Obama and her clothing is fundamentally different from the clothes that Barack Obama wears. You don't get the same kind of reporting. They're not the same kind of celebrity, based singularly on their genitalia, essentially, and the way our society, and you can read that right back into everything that you guys have been talking about. So actually, in the White House, no, they're not the same celebrities.
Okay, but I could take that point and run with it in a class then by looking at expectations for female dress versus expectations for male dress. And so my male colleagues can get by with having however many pair of khakis and however many whatever kinds of shirts that are interchangeable. But if I'm going to wear suits every day, I can't repeat the same navy blue blazer. I have to have this bright blue blazer and a red blazer to wear on Friday. God forbid I be caught on campus without wearing red on Friday at Houston. You know, 10,000 other blazers or whatnot. And so it's not just an issue for first ladies, it's an issue in the larger culture. So,
Yes.
Two comments on kind of gendered dress in politics. One is, you know, of course you can carry it to the males because George Washington, when he's heading up to New England for that first tour as president, is very consciously wearing a brown, I forget what the material was, suit. Because he's not going to go dressed as a general, because he's not. You know, he's a civilian leader. And he's certainly not going to be putting on the airs of a king. So, you know, that kind of image does carry through our politics. The problem is guys are pretty boring and wear suits, whereas Michelle Obama has some really stunning dresses. And as far as, you know, kind of campus goes, my mother-in-law taught calculus for 35 years at Trinity College in D.C., pretty much wore the same suit every single time. You know, changed a few things here and there, but, you know, she kept a very basic wardrobe. So some of that's choice. And
Yes.
Since you suggested some more contemporary presidents as well, but earlier I think Bruce asked how such a president would range in terms of dissidents. Could you suggest including contemporary, more contemporary people, or the three that you raised, who might be what you would say first, second, whatever, you have to look for everyone, but maybe the first or second. And second, I can't help but ask again, since you're talking about contemporary and spoken about, I think it was talking about how we're going to write about people after the White House. What is Michelle Obama going to do after the White House?
whatever she wants.
Does anybody have any idea? No, but I think it's exceptionally talented woman in practice, like American Lady, which has something.
She worked for, she's been working for a large, before the White House, she worked for some large nonprofit with the Chicago health system.
Yeah.
So,
okay, so I forget what talk I was at, and the speaker was discussing the discovery of Barack Obama when he was being groomed to make his first race. And I think this individual said, yes, we're going to go to the Chicago home of a really up-and-coming lawyer who's very sharp and eloquent and the like. And the person got there and saw Michelle Obama working the room and Barack Obama being much more of the introvert that he is. And this person's assumption was that Michelle Obama was the lawyer being groomed for a political race, not Barack Obama. I don't think she has any interest in running for political office, but she has the personality in a way that Barack does not.
Well, if I could just note, during the campaign, she got very negative coverage. The first campaign, because she made some remarks that were somewhat controversial about race. And since then, she has been so careful in what she said. And so presumably, she is constrained tremendously by her position as the first African-American First Lady to behave in a certain way and to only have causes that are sort of suitable for First Ladies, rather than being able to make more use of her education and her intellect. I think she's really been sort of held down.
That New Yorker cover, right? Remember?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, yes.
Oh, yes, okay.
It's interesting since we've been talking about the academic graveyard of congressional biography, but then, all of you are working on or have already published, a biography of First Lady. Can we broaden this a little bit, and what do you think about the future of biography as legitimate scholarship, and how, what's its future?
It's split, right? So academic departments, I think, are very divided on whether biography is legitimate scholarship or not. I have one colleague who I respect quite a bit. I think this individual is naive on this point, but does not think that biography can ever be analytical, and that biography is much more narrow. And I'm thinking, not really, because unless you're talking about someone who only lived for 5 days, then why would you write a biography about them? That person's life is going to span multiple political eras, and you're going to have to figure out that the big questions that we've been talking about, continuity versus change, or do we have breakpoints, or do we have continuation? I think biography is a fabulous vehicle for analysis and the like, but there is that challenge. I think, having done both biography and not biography, biography might be harder in the sense that you're having to get inside this person's head, and you have to like the person, but you have to be objective about the person, and so it's challenge in that way, and you have to know multiple historiographies, right? If you have a long-lived person, then you have a bigger challenge. So I'm an advocate of doing it, but not for someone who's in graduate school, and not for someone who's not yet, I would say not yet a full professor even, just because of the time trap of doing a biography, because the focus of every associate professor ought to be that second book to get full, because
yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, if you start with a biography, it kind of puts you on this trajectory that seems to kind of go to a dead end in a way, although it doesn't need to, but I think it sort of should come later. But I think biography is thriving. I mean, I'm just thinking of, Frank Sigliola's last book, the book about Roosevelt and Churchill, and it used a lot of biographical treatments there to make it just really come alive. The love affairs, and I thought it was really fun. Maybe people criticize his portrayals of Roosevelt versus Truman, etc. But I think biography is alive and well and thriving. And I think that actually Casey's gone now, but some of the people he mentioned, Mr. Dill and the other fellow, I mean, they deserve more attention. This is great stuff.
Yeah. Yes, back.
Your question in terms of historiography, more general, American history. Normally when a field emerges, we see the pattern of the most publicly prominent in terms of class status and institutional affiliation. Those are the people who get the first attention, and then things move to the ones we have to dig more on, more about, more refine. And since women's history then became gender history, but the foundation of women's history already in the 1960s, it just occurred to me when I was sitting here, why is it that we've had women's history and gender history now for decades, and first ladies, who you would have thought might have been the first people who would have been turned to in women's history, have been ignored, even to the point where you're talking about still being in graduate school and getting scoffed at by professors who would say, oh, well, you're writing about women, and I think, well, gee, this may have happened 50 years ago. How is it that this got flipped this way? I mean, it's a counterfactual question, but I'm just curious. What do you think?
Well, I mean, I think, first ladies, Lou Gould, I think, did an amazing job in making them sort of become more visible and accessible, but they have been covered, but always sort of as like little encyclopedia entries, right? Sort of the adjunct to the real story of the president, right? So I don't know if they were totally ignored, but I think you've written about this in some of your work, certainly, Nancy, which is that they were just, you know, this elite history. It wasn't really, and I think it didn't really grab the social historians, and so I think that they didn't actually benefit from this opening up into gender history, because they were not really considered, you know, very interested. They were just kind of considered these elite people on a pedestal, right? And
So the first lady is not women first, they're first ladies.
Exactly. And to just follow up on Katie's point, when Lou is legitimizing the study of women's history, we're deep. That's exactly at the same time we're deep into the social history, dominance of the discipline, and shifting from social history to through race, class, and gender to cultural history. Exactly. So studying First Ladies did not in any way, shape, or form fit what everyone was supposed to be doing.
They were elitist. They weren't interesting culturally, I guess.
Well, also, I think too, it's because you can't exactly figure out what their power is, because maybe their power was something that they said to their husbands on a pillow talk. You know, it's a lot of women's history, I think, deals with women in power, women not without power. The power relationship. In the case of the First Ladies, because we don't know the intimacies of the marriages, we don't know exactly what happened. Even in the case of Eleanor Roosevelt, as public as she was, we don't know all the things that went on with her and Franklin by any means, or her exact role in the New Deal even.
So Pat Nixon should be next.
I'm sorry, what?
No, I said I guess Pat Nixon would be a good First Lady to go to next.
Yes.
Everything would have been recorded.
I have an idea which relates, I think, to the last comment. You know, we have the limitations of biography to be taken seriously, but we've had quite a few First Ladies, and we looked at governors and other people's spouses, and why don't we try to create a larger population of like all these First Ladies and throw in some more political spouses, maybe who got elected governor after their husband died, and take a look at the relationships of the experience they had when women weren't given full scope, but they had scope through their husbands, and some of them by self-selection went into politics by choosing their husband, maybe, like we had some recent ones, and try to be a political scientist and generalize a bit on the relationship between the experience of the First Lady or Governor's wife and the advance of women to higher political office. And has this been, some experience was gained and some exposure, but has this been a help or not? Anyway, I think something could be done.
Well, with Hillary Clinton, yes, indeed. Yes, I think that's what you have in mind. Yes.
I'm leaving Imelda Marcos out of it, and she moved up by now.
But I think some of the women who say took over after the husbands died, you know, earlier, say in the 20th century, it was, I mean, I don't want to say tokenism exactly, but it didn't necessarily have any legs, right? It didn't necessarily lead anywhere, I think. They sort of served their term, and that was it in most cases.
Except when it did, because Margaret Chase Smith is a good example of a woman who succeeds her husband, but then becomes a force in her own right. And there are others. I could tick off lots of names. I'm blanking. Oregon.
Rankin? Jack Rankin?
No, later.
That was my only.
It'll come to me in the cold walking back to the hotel.
But you had your question. You had a second part of your question about ranks, and we never answered it. Were you wanting us to?
The first part was we did a ranking and just two or three women who we think were the best person. I vaguely remember Lady Bird Hampton being quite active. It comes to my mind, but I have no idea whether I had a closer look at it, whether she seemed to be, or it's just my imagination.
Yeah. No, she was.
She was.
Absolutely, yeah. on a number of causes. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Environment and
She patterned
start-
herself, after Eleanor
Yeah,
Roosevelt.
yeah.
She said that, huh?
definitely.
Oh, sure.
Some more
Yeah.
questions.
Okay. Well, now, do you each want to answer that? Give a ranking, and then we can take a couple more questions, and we must conclude.
I mean, certainly you see often in the polls that Hillary and Eleanor are at the top of the list. For me, I think it's so difficult to give those rankings because you have to take into account the political context and the state of womanhood at the time. You know, if we're using our standards of what's great for women today and we're applying that to Sarah Polk, well, of course she's going to look like she did nothing, you know? And so it would really, I think, take a deep analysis of these women to truly understand in their context how great they were.
And from that perspective, so I'll give some names across the centuries. Dolly Madison, I would put her in the mix for sure. Frances Cleveland, I would put her in the mix. So that's my token to the 19th century. And I'm going to try to pull some that you wouldn't necessarily expect. I would put Betty Ford and Rosalind Carter in there. Betty Ford makes it okay to talk about breast cancer. And if for nothing else.
Yeah, exactly. She was very, and
she
also
makes it okay to talk about addiction. Yeah. But how many women's lives were saved because she talked about breast cancer?
Yeah. And I have to bullet vote for Florence because she's always overlooked. So.
Okay, great. I think I saw a couple more hands up. Yes, the two of you, the gentleman in the back,
I just, isn't it true that when we're talking about First Ladies, we're talking more about causes than about policy or power? I mean,
it depends. It really depends. Lady Bird Johnson lobbied for and was responsible for the passage of some of the environmental legislation from the 1960s, specifically the highway billboard.
In certain cases, yes, but in Eleanor, of course. But in the main, it seems mostly, again, causes more than really policies that they're bringing forward.
But causes can lead to policies, and they did. I mean, in the case of the prisons, the women's prisons that Florence was involved with, I mean, she behind the scenes was trying to open up the federal prisons so that they would have a situation for women. Women would have a separate. And in the end, policies were passed. And she didn't actually create the policy, but she influenced.
Yeah, but it's become accepted for first ladies to have causes of a suitable type.
Right.
And that's, I think, started by Eleanor Roosevelt.
I mean, Florence Harding was kind to animals. I mean, they all had their causes.
Well, not all. I think it was a process. I don't think they all had causes. I think causes was more maybe a 20th century.
It's a 20th century.
From Eleanor on, with the exception maybe of
Mamie.
Truman.
Mrs. Truman.
What about Ellen Wilson? She had some causes.
To your point, Maureen, that the causes, but causal, we don't know.
Exactly.
Right? So Eleanor could have been spearheading some really important components of the New Deal. We don't know what the
Well, Eleanor's exceptional.
But every first lady is her own person, just as every president is his own person. So I think it's, you have to get in, you have to, okay, did she leave papers or not? So I think we're going to get a far different picture of Barbara Bush and find Barbara Bush to be much more involved than her flip line, I'm just an old lady in fake pearls, or whatever it was she said. I think we're going to find her to be incredibly important behind the scenes in the first Bush presidency. We just won't know until the papers are open.
You had a comment too. Thank you.
This man's comment actually segues into mine, I think. One factor we haven't really addressed very specifically is the fact that this government of ours is a republic and not a monarchy. And it has been the male so far who has been the elected figure. And it seems to me that that is an institutional constraint leading to the emphasis on causes, provided that they're not too partisan because the First Lady role is not an elected role. Now, it is a celebrity role, it's become one, and it has somewhat monarchical trappings at times, the gowns that are on display in the Smithsonian, things like that. But it is a role that is inherently constrained by the fact that it is not an elected office.
Yes. Well, thank you. Thank you very much for your comments, and thank you for being here. Thank you.